So thanks to all of you for coming along this morning. My name is Steffen. I'm Executive Director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University across the lake here. And I also play a role as an independent expert advisor on the multi-party Committee on Climate Change at the Australian government. I'll return to that in a moment. First, I'd like to introduce my two international guests this morning. First, on my left, your right, is Professor Katherine Richardson. She's a professor in biological oceanography and Vice Dean for Public Outreach, Faculty of Science at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. But more importantly, for the purposes of this conference, she chaired the Danish Committee for Climate Change Policy, which recently delivered a very comprehensive report on a roadmap for the way forward for Denmark in terms of decarbonizing its economy by 2050. On my right is Professor Johan Rockström, who's Executive Director of the Stockholm Environment Institute and also the Stockholm Resilience Center. Last year, 2009, Johan was named as Swede of the Year, which is the equivalent of the Australian of the Year here in Australia. And he also has played a role over the years in advising the Swedish government on climate and environmental issues. Now, the reason we have them both down here at the same time is that tomorrow, the Australian Academy of Sciences, through its National Committee on Earth System Science, will be releasing a decadal strategic plan for Earth System Science in Australia. If you like, Earth System Science, of course, includes climate science, but it puts it in a broader societal context, and it's a step forward in integrating social and natural sciences in terms of trying to deal with the big challenges that face Australia. Dr. Roger Gifford, who's here in the front row, is the chair of that committee, and he will be launching the report at 6 o'clock tomorrow evening at the Academy of Sciences at the Shine Dome. So we're very appreciative to the Academy and to Roger for making it possible to have both Katherine and Johan with us today. Now, I mentioned my role as independent expert advisor to the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee. There are obviously a couple of really key issues that we're facing here in Australia. One of them has directly to do with the terms of reference of that committee, and that is to work out how we best put a price on carbon to send a signal to our economy to continue that process, accelerate that process, decarbonizing the economy. And there are many interesting deliberations we've already had and will have on that issue. The second thing, though, is that it's often said, and we often hear this, that why should Australia go it alone? Why should we take action? Why should we go first? When in fact, when you look around the world, we're actually behind what most of the rest of the world is doing. And if anything, we've got a catch-up job to do. So this is an excellent opportunity, I think, for us here in Australia to learn from two countries up in the Northern Hemisphere who have taken many actions already to deal with the climate change issue, to reduce their emissions and to decarbonize their economies. So that's going to be the main theme of this press conference. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Katherine to tell us a bit about the report and more broadly what Denmark is doing to reduce its emissions. Katherine.
Thanks, Will. As you said, I was the chairman of the Danish Climate Commission for the last 2.5 years, and we reported here on the 28th of September. Now, this commission was 10 independent academics, I would say. Maybe most of us were scientists, but 5 on the commission were economists. And I have to say, having sat in the chair for 2.5 years, I've learned a lot about economy, and not least of which the fact that economics is anything but an exact science. But this commission, we were all independent, and we were asked, it was called the Climate Commission, but in fact, our mandate was twofold. The first was to identify if, how, and when Denmark could become independent of fossil fuels, and the second was to take into account that the EU goal is that developed countries should reduce their, or industrialized countries should reduce their fossil fuel, or their greenhouse gas emissions by between 80 and 95% by 2050. So we had this double agenda, and I think it's really, really important that we had this double agenda because it means that there's actually very broad support in Denmark for this agenda. Some people are interested in it because of the greenhouse gas and the climate issue, but very many, and probably, if I should be honest, more people are interested in the agenda because our energy security in the future is not certain. We import all of our coal, unlike you, so we import all of our coal. We do have some oil and gas, but our sources are dwindling, and within the next few years we will be a net importer of oil and gas. And of course, oil, first of all, the reserves that we have on this planet are limited. Actually, the reserves that we have of fossil fuels are all limited. So there's a supply and demand problem with respect to using fossil fuels, and fossil fuels can only get more expensive. However, the oil problem is particularly acute, partly because, as far as we know, there's only about 42 years of reserves for global use out there. We will find more. Of course we will find more. But I promise you that that can't go on forever. And why can't it go on forever? Because we are burning every year as a global community, we are burning the same amount that it took nature about 1 million years to build up. Now what that means is that we're loaning resources at subprime conditions, and we all know what happens to subprime loans. So sooner or later, we all have to operate and make our energy systems independent of fossil fuels. Now, what we said was, well, we don't know when that's going to happen. So we said, okay, in terms of greenhouse gas reductions, politicians are talking about 2050 as a goal. Let's go in and see if we could do it in Denmark by 2050. Could we be independent of fossil fuels by 2050? And we did the analysis, and we found out, yes, we could. We said, well, but could we do it earlier? And I should say, our energy system also includes transport when we do this. And we looked at it and we said, well, yes, for certain sectors, heat and electricity, for example, we think it could be done earlier, but it would be more expensive because we would have to retire infrastructure before its normal lifetime has run through. So our conclusion was, yes, it could be done by 2050, but what was even more interesting was that our analyses showed that it would basically not be more expensive than carrying on in a fossil fuel future. Yes, right now, today, it's more expensive to use other energies than fossil fuels. However, fossil fuels can only get more expensive, and if you take the price prognoses from the International Energy Agency, which is anything but a radical club on the block, if you take their price prognoses for fossil fuel development, it turns out that after over a 30 or 40-year time period, that it actually is not more expensive to move to other sources of energy than fossil fuels. So the government has responded to our report, and I should say that our economic analyses, I was kind of disappointed because a year ago we came to this conclusion, and my macroeconomist said, oh, no, this can't be right. Everybody knows that that's not the way it is. And so they planned an entirely different analysis, and a macroeconomic analysis, went through it, and it was the same result. And at the same time, there was a study in the EU that showed the same thing, and yet another study. So there are many studies now that are beginning to develop that shows that if you look over a 40-year time period, it's not going to be more expensive to use other energy sources than fossil fuels. The government then has announced that they accept the goal, that Denmark has the goal of becoming independent of fossil fuels by 2050. That goal has the support of both sides of the parliament, but for various reasons, as I say. Some people have it as their goal because of the climate agenda, and other people because of the energy security agenda. At the moment, the oil resources that we know, or reserves that we know out there, are confined to a very small number of countries, mostly in the Middle East. And I don't want to play a Middle East card. What I'm trying to say is that whatever happens, we don't know who our friends are in 30 or 40 years' time. So if our oil is in the hands of a handful of countries, then we make ourselves very vulnerable with respect to our energy security. At the moment, our government is planning what tools they will use to arrive at this goal. We came with 40 recommendations in our report, and they're analyzing which of them they're going to be using. They are expecting to report early in 2011. I think there is absolutely no doubt but what the tax system will be used to achieve these goals, but not only a carbon tax. We are talking about, and as far as I can ascertain, It has a broad political support for making a review, a revamping of the whole tax system, and in fact, the Danish industrial organizations also agree to this, or support the idea of using the tax system, including carbon tax, to arrive at this goal, but of course they argue that taxes, the overall tax burden, should not be higher. We recommended, as one of our most important mechanisms for achieving the goal, we recommended a tax on the use of fossil fuels, not on CO2, not on the emissions, but on the use of fossil fuels. Why that? Well, at the moment, if you have a tax on carbon emission, it is the same thing as a tax on fossil fuels. But if, and no one knows if this is going to happen, if CCS comes online and is economically viable, then having a tax on emissions isn't going to move you away from fossil fuels. So if your goal is to become independent of fossil fuels, it's important that you use economic mechanisms to get people to choose other forms of energy. We actually recommended that this tax should start at a very low level and increase through time. Its most important job being to make sure that one didn't reinvest in infrastructure for fossil fuels over time. So it is clear that fossil fuels are going to become more expensive. We just don't know when, and we want to prevent people from continuing to invest in infrastructure that has to do with fossil fuels. One thing about the energy system is that infrastructure has a notoriously long life, and if you plan your transition from a fossil fuel energy system to a green energy system, then you can plan it in such a way that you use your infrastructure until it's run out, and then you can replace it. Finally, as a final note, I'd say that in Denmark there is also considerable optimism with respect to this agenda, since sooner or later all countries are going to have to do this. And we believe that there is a great potential in green growth. At the moment, Denmark, 12%, almost 12% of Denmark's export portfolio is associated with technologies that can be used for energy efficiency or technologies that are directly related to green technology. And we expect this to be a more and more important part of our economic basis for welfare in Denmark, is investing in this green energy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Now I'd like to turn to Johan and tell us a bit about the Swedish situation.
Thanks, Will, and good morning, everyone. I represent an institute that primarily works with international climate policy research, but I'll focus in a bit on Sweden. And I think the right starting point is that Sweden had its equivalent to the Climate Commission as Australia and Denmark, which reported to the Swedish government in mid-2009. It was also a group of independent scientists that checked off the scientific consensus and landed in the conclusion that Sweden must contribute to stabilize the climate at a concentration of greenhouse gases of 400 ppm carbon equivalents, which is, as you may know, 350 ppm carbon dioxide, and we are today at 390 ppm. So the Swedish consensus, the Swedish political consensus, is in fact that we have already put the world in a danger position. The translation of that was very similar to the Danish position, that Sweden needs to contribute itself with 40% reductions by 2020 and essentially decarbonize by 2050. And this is also interestingly something which is largely supported across the political facets of Swedish Parliament. So that's a very important starting point. It was very influenced by the UK Scientific Climate Commission, which, as you may know, also has come to the conclusion that UK must contribute to basically 80–90% reductions by 2050. So what has Sweden done in this area? Well, Sweden is, as you may know, one of a handful of countries that has met its Kyoto commitments. It has reduced its emissions by 8% already and is on its way to reduce by at least 30% by 2020. It is arguably perhaps the only country in the world that has done that through active climate policy. So the handful of countries that have, since they met the Kyoto Protocol, have sometimes been lucky, like the UK, which basically by old changes in phasing out obsolete coal dependence actually meet its Kyoto Protocol commitments more by luck than by active policy. So what has Sweden done? Well, Science shows increasingly through empirical evidence that a carbon tax can be very effective as a way of giving incentives to phase out fossil dependence, and that a carbon tax in the order of 40 to 50 euros per ton of carbon dioxide starts giving incentives for moving away from business as usual. So instead of doing just energy efficiency, you actually start transforming energy systems. The European trading scheme, as you know, has been operating at a carbon tax level of roughly 17 euros per ton of carbon dioxide, which is why you could argue that the trading scheme has not worked as hoped, because it has not created that incentive. Well, Sweden introduced in 1991 a carbon tax of 100 euros per ton of carbon dioxide. So Sweden has been operating for essentially 20 years at a carbon tax which outpaces all countries in the world at a level that would be considered as very detrimental for any economy if you would, so say, introduce it on blank sheet today. The interesting thing is that this has led to a very clear decoupling of the Swedish economy. So you've had a very stable economic growth while a decoupling in terms of emissions. It has led to a transformative change in the whole heating sector, from oil and coal to renewables, primarily from residuals from the Swedish forest industry, and it has also had great impacts on industry and on transport in Sweden. So it's an example of a carbon tax operating not within the UN legislation, not within any EU legislation, but a domestic carbon tax which has been operating without negative impacts on the economy. One reason for this, of course, is that the Swedish government chose early to say that this has to be a budget-neutral tax, which means that what has been done in explicit terms is raising the carbon tax while reducing costs for employers. So you basically matched the cost with reduced tax and created a budget-neutral situation. Furthermore, Sweden has not worked its climate policy only on carbon tax. It has a basket of policies very much in line with what Katherine is pointing out. We have green electricity certificates, which is a way of putting incentives, particularly for expansion of wind, the wind sector, where you give certificates for renewable energy producers, which are then sold to the energy utilities. And then there's been a very articulate way of putting forward subsidies for those counties in Sweden that have made transformations to meet the carbon tax requirements. Subsidies to introduce, for example, to move from coal to renewable energy heating plants. We also have, as you may know, quite a politically debated subsidy for environmental cars. So we pay a specific amount of money to change vehicles, for example, to more environmentally friendly car parks. So there's a whole basket of different carrots and sticks operating, and that, I think, is something that can be learned from as one example. Finally, just for a moment jumping away from Sweden, I'd just like to share with you that we have also therefore been an example for some studies around the world, and one of them is not surprisingly China, because China has an increasing interest in what are the policy measures that could successfully, so say, give China an incentive to move towards a low-carbon economy. And together with something called the Chinese Economist 50 Forum, which is the 50 leading macroeconomists in China, we've led a research analysis just in line with the Danish Commission to ask the question, can China move towards a low-carbon economy without threatening its economic growth? And interestingly, the results of this very controversial study, which in fact was so controversial that we had to cancel the press conference at COP15 in Copenhagen because the Chinese delegation did not want to, at that point, share science that show that China in fact can commit itself to emission reductions even within the UN framework, which shows that it would make a lot of sense for China to move towards targets similar to the targets put up in the EU of 20-30% by 2020. And that it can be done through what measure? Well, primarily carbon tax. That it would be, so to say, when on balance, too difficult to introduce a carbon trading system in China on the short term, because the institutional setup is not there, while a carbon tax could be quite effective. And this is now increasingly a discussion in China, I would say. So that's an interesting movement, I think, internationally, that carbon tax is becoming more and more discussed as a very effective measure, at least on the short term, to make this necessary transition, and that Sweden can be used, I think, as one example of that, has been operating for a very long time. So I think that's the summary. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Johan. Now let's open it up for any questions to our two guests. Yes.
Christian Kerr from the Australian. Just to begin with, the typical Australian argument is that we are a large country, sparsely populated, we are energy intensive, and coal plays an important part in our economy. Therefore, we tend to think of ourselves, or our politicians tend to think of themselves, as a special case. Are they entitled to do so when it comes to carbon policy?
Look, I think one of the interesting things, I'll just make some comments, is that every country has its own set of conditions. If you look at Europe, it's often said, well, Europe's far more densely populated, it's easier to bring in more efficient transport systems and something. But I will ask Johan to comment a little bit on that, because Sweden, in fact, is a very long north-south country, and large parts of it are as sparsely populated as Australia is, because of the cold there, and of course because of the aridity here. But I think the answer to that is we may have to take different approaches in some ways because of the different nature of the economy. But the real challenge, I think, is for us in Australia to think, all right, how can we achieve the same sort of ambitious targets that these two countries are already on the road to doing, whilst maintaining a very vibrant Australian economy? And that's the real challenge we face. I just make one more comment before I turn on to the others. I was at a CCS conference in Melbourne about a fortnight ago. And there was a very, very interesting discussion because there was a lot of pessimism there that CCS will be viable in time and at cost to help the coal industry. In fact, there was some very strong comments about a very dismal future for the coal industry and the power sector. But CCS may become important if, like Johan has said, we want to hit 350 ppm CO2 rather than 400, 450 ppm. We're going to need to get it out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere, not necessarily in the biosphere because it tends to come back up fairly quickly. So in the longer term, CCS may play a role. And given the fact that Australia is a major player in research, certainly my thought on that was we shouldn't abandon the research on that technology. It may be a very important technology in the future, but not in the way we think about it today. So I think if we're a bit more creative in how we think in Australia of the opportunities that arise from taking a more vigorous approach toward reducing our emissions, we may see some economic opportunities, as well as the obvious constraints that you pointed to. Now let me turn to my colleagues, maybe Johan first on the Swedish situation.
You know, you're absolutely right, Will, but I think in terms of population density, Australia perhaps is more sparsely populated, but Sweden is clearly a country with, it's largely forest with a few people scattered. And it's a very cold country, which therefore has very high energy needs. But I think it's fair to say that Sweden, of course, has one peculiarity, which is its large privilege of having hydro covering 40% of the electricity production, and another 40% coming from nuclear power, which is another peculiarity. But on the other hand, Sweden has a very high dependence on natural gas, oil, particularly for mobility. And that is a challenge which I think, just in line with what Katherine is saying, that the conclusion is that we're sort of seeing the writing on the wall, that we're coming to say it's the beginning of the end of the fossil era, and then you might as well be perhaps not absolutely first on the block, but among the forerunners in terms of that transition, and that is at least analytically concluded to be economically smart to do at this stage of development. But of course, every country has its own peculiarity. I should also say one other thing, which I think applies for Australia and certainly does for Sweden, that we can no longer really talk of nation states in this discussion, for the simple reason that I've been talking very warmly about the achievements of Sweden, but there's one area where Sweden has really dismally failed, and that is that the official numbers of emission reductions is that Sweden has reduced its emission by 8%, and Sweden is very proud for that, it should be. But when we do the analysis of the total carbon footprint of Sweden, in fact, the emissions have increased by roughly 7% over the last 20 years. Why? Because of the net import of carbon-intensive goods and services due to increased consumption. So we've had increased economic growth and thereby also increased consumption, and we largely import our coal carbon from China, which means that any country today that wants to position itself towards a low-carbon economy needs to also look at its neighbors, look at its trade neighbors, and work this as a budget, in my mind, which includes the total flux of carbon also in terms of imports. And that also changes in a way that no country can claim to be a peculiarity, because every country is so dependent on global trade, Australia as Sweden as Denmark.
I think I'd also like to add to that. I totally agree with Will that every country has to think how they're going to do it themselves, because everyone has their own peculiarities and their own profile. But I think actually, in a strange way, the pressure is more on individual countries now because of the apparent failure of the COP process to be able to establish a global framework for us. Everyone last year said, oh, phew, we'll get a global framework, and then, you know, it probably won't be good enough, but we can all relax and just see how that works. We didn't get it. We're not going to get it this year, and I don't think we're going to get a global framework in the very near future. But what we did see is the fact that this agenda is not going to go away. There are countries that are taking it very, very seriously, and maybe even more importantly, there are consumers and multinational companies that are taking it very, very seriously. Our largest energy company in Denmark has stated, when they stated this 2 years ago, their profile was 85% of their energy came from fossil fuels and 15% from renewables. And they made the goal that by 2040, they would reverse it so that it was 15% from fossil fuels and mostly gas, and 85% from renewables. Nobody is forcing them to do it. They're doing it because they expect that that's going to be demanded by the consumer in 2040. They've also made the goal of cutting it to 50% renewables by 2020, and they say they're ahead of schedule. And when people start doing this, they discover it's really much easier than they thought. But not least of which China. I mean, I totally agree with what you said there. Interestingly enough, our report from our Climate Commission is because of interest in China being translated to Chinese. There's going to be more copies in Chinese than in Danish when they finish doing the translation. So this is, because we didn't get a global framework, every nation has to decide where they're going to stand here. And it looks like it could be a competition, a strategic competition area. No one can say it for sure. There's nothing that's harder to predict than the future. But there is this very real possibility, given that everyone is going to have to make the change sooner or later, that this is where real growth potential lies. And I've thought a lot about it coming down here. I don't know whether it's a blessing or a curse to have as much coal as you do.
Thanks. Any other questions?
Since I think I'm the only journo here, if I can fire away a bit
Go
more.
ahead.
Look, Katherine, talking about blessings and curses, another mineral Australia has a lot of is uranium. Johan mentioned nuclear. Should Australia consider embracing nuclear to reduce its emissions?
Nuclear is definitely part of the transition solution. I'm not sure it is ultimately a solution, but in terms of the transition to a green global energy system, nuclear is a part of the picture. 30% of our electricity in Europe comes from nuclear, so it's, you know, Denmark has decided it's not going to have nuclear, so it's not a part of our solution, but it's certainly a part of the global solution, and it is up to Australia to decide whether it thinks it is a solution for Australia. But I would certainly not eliminate it at day one, and I would say that even though Denmark made a political decision something like 20 years ago or 30 years ago now not to have nuclear, we in our panel looked at it as well to see, we said that even though there is this political decision, if it is a clear advantage for Denmark to go nuclear, even though we have a hard time placing a windmill on land, but if there's a clear advantage in going nuclear, then we will recommend it. And we did not find in the Danish situation that it was a clear advantage, mostly because we already have so much fluctuating green energy in our system, and nuclear doesn't, nuclear isn't something where you go in Monday morning and say, oh, I need 30% more and turn it up. So you know, I can't answer that question, but I think it's a question that Australia ought to look at very, very closely.
Yeah, and anything on
Well, as a scientist, we have a Swedish ambassador here as well. It's a very sensitive issue. But my way to answer that is as follows. We carried out a study, SCI, trying to answer the question, can the EU reduce its emission by 40% by 2020 without nuclear? So we were asked to basically turn every stone on all the renewable technology options available for the EU 27. And the final results of that show that the EU can do it, but only under one condition, that you combine energy efficiency with renewable, with changes in lifestyle. You cannot do it without changes in lifestyle. You in fact need to see shifts in the way we transport ourselves, in the way we consume, in the way we heat and cool our cities. And but it could be done without nuclear. So I think the kind of complementary answer to Katherine is that nuclear certainly has to be part of the options because we are already in a danger zone, because we've already transgressed the, let's say, the safe level of concentration of greenhouse gases. However, it would probably be very unwise to invest in nuclear, which is a finite energy source, if it means that you thereby do not support renewable energy strategies. So if you're simply just substituting one fossil source to another one, and then you end up in 40 years sitting there against the wall again, it's not a positive option for a continent such as Australia, which has one of the world's largest solar potentials, for example. I mean, I think that's the kind of trade-off issue that one has to consider. But as you know, and the Swedish ambassador can fill in this much better than I, that Sweden has chosen exactly this policy, that we have nuclear, and we're actually today accepting to invest in our nuclear capacity to actually upgrade it and improve it in the future as a complement to be able to contribute to a low carbon future. So Sweden is certainly on that track. And
what this audience doesn't know, Johan, and we probably should tell them, is that there's been a little bad blood between Denmark and Sweden because we don't have nuclear, but they have a big nuclear plant right outside.
I can tell you, this is something that...
This goes back centuries.
They have good beer in Denmark. That's the only reason why we can cope with this.
and very good ice hockey in Sweden. Okay, any more questions?
So just one more for Katherine, then a very quick one for you, Will. Yeah. Katherine, as Will said, there's a lot of pessimism now over carbon capture and storage, or looming pessimism in Australia. I was interested to hear you actually mention it, given that degree of pessimism. What's your view? Does it have a future?
Well, I have to say that I agree with Will that it's important that we continue the research on it. I suspect it probably doesn't have a future in terms of, or at least a very long-lived future in terms of coal-fired power plants. I mean, I think that would be prolonging the agony. And I wonder, it's going to cost an awful lot of money to invest in it. And if it's only to prolong the period that we can be using coal, I think it's probably problematic. But I think it's very, very important that we continue looking at carbon capture and storage, because if we could put it onto biomass-fired plants, or decouple it from the energy production, in other words, or there are certain industries, the cement industry, paper industries, I mean, there are certain industries where it's going to be very, very difficult to bring the emissions down. And if we could equip these industries with mechanisms for carbon capture and storage, I think that would be a very positive thing. So I wouldn't be putting all of my eggs in the CCS basket if I had coal, I have to say.
Well, we've just had a mine, I believe, this week over the pace of a carbon price. When do you think is feasible, literally, to expect to see legislation?
Okay, I think if you work backwards from how fast we can actually move as a committee, I think we can get the job that myself and the other independent experts have to do. We need to get that done by February, March next year. That is, update the Garneau review, and Ross is working very hard on that. I'm updating the science. I plan to deliver that by the end of January. Rod Sims is, I know, working on the electricity sector implications for that, and Patricia Faulkner for the social implications. We need to deliver that by March so that the committee has several meetings where it can take that new information into account. We've commissioned some other work. One is is a piece of work done by the Productivity Commission to look at the carbon price in other countries, the real price and the shadow price, where a combination of regulation and subsidies are used. But economists have a way of converting that into a shadow price, so that we have a good comparison of what other countries are doing and looking at the level of effort that they're making. Looking at it realistically, I don't think there's any way we could get legislation through the first half of 2011. We've got more work to do as a committee. But I think it is conceivable that we could get legislation through the second half of 2011 if we're efficient in our work. And the first challenge is to us as the experts to get our stuff on the table. And if you then look at that, then if you get legislation through in the second half of 2011, you would be looking at somewhere in 2012. I think the key thing is a clear message that Katherine made, is that the sooner that you send a clear signal to the economy, the better it is for investment. I give a fair few talks on climate science to the private sector, to industry and so on, and I'm getting a very clear message, is that they want to see some clarity and certainty on a carbon price. I less and less hear, we don't want a carbon price, so we're afraid of it. I hardly ever hear that now. What they want to know is, when's this coming in? What's it going to look like? What's the instrument going to look like? Because we've got to make some important investments, and we're hanging back until that's done. So there's pressure from all sorts of quarters for us to get on with this and get the job done sooner rather than later. Any other questions or comments? Sorry, yeah.
I don't know if the ambassador has the right to ask questions. I like to do it. First, to the two of my Nordic colleagues, could you say a bit more about wind power? Denmark has invested heavily in wind power, and there I can understand it because it replaces coal and oil and gas. I have great difficulty in understanding why Sweden does it, because we are basically replacing hydro or nuclear power. Since it is extremely expensive, as far as I understood, it's subsidized heavily by maybe 50% of the cost in Sweden through these green certificates. And on top of that, you can, according to what I have been told, count basically only 5% of the energy that is produced as a stable contribution to the energy system because of the uncertainty of the wind. Is this true, and what can you tell us about that? And to Will, how come that geothermal energy is so little exploited in this country? In Sweden, it's extremely popular. My farm in Sweden, which is heated by geothermal energy, I operate from here to due to my computer, and it's a very efficient and very cheap energy, as far as I can judge. Why is this not more used in Australia?
Okay, let's start with the wind question first.
Yeah. Yes, Denmark uses a lot of wind already. 20% of our electricity comes from wind, but only if you take our total energy system, including our transport, it's only about 3% of our total gross energy which comes from wind. And all of our prognoses about the future, and we have a number of future pictures that we study, since, as I say, nothing is harder to predict than the future, but all of our future pictures include an increase in wind. Why? Because wind is actually, although everyone goes around and says it's very expensive, wind is actually the cheapest of the, biomass is cheaper at the moment, but biomass prices are going to increase for the same reason. But if you look at wind, solar, tidal, wave energy, that kind of energy, wind is actually the cheapest. And in our analysis, we arrive at the conclusion that if wind becomes something like 60% of the gross energy supplier in Denmark in 2050, that the price of electricity, if we continue on a fossil fuel road, the price of electricity to the consumer will be 2.5 krona per kilowatt hour. At the moment it's around 2. If you use fossil fuels. So the bottom line is energy is going to get more expensive because of this huge increase in demand for energy. But if you do it, if you produce it by wind in 2050, it will cost 2.6 krona. That is to say 10 euros difference, which is really nothing. And so it's not as expensive as one has gotten the image that it is. And of course, clearly, it can only get less expensive as time goes on. Denmark is located in such a way, you have to understand Denmark is flat, totally flat, so there's nothing like hydro in it. But we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of coast, we have a lot of possibility for offshore wind parks, and we also have companies that are leaders in the production of offshore wind parks. So this is a growth area for us. We see our solution as having wind, some solar, but biomass, we have more biomass per capita than the average in the EU. And then we're very happily placed and on an electricity grid with both Sweden and Norway, who do have hydropower. So that combination, we believe, with backup with biogas, so that if our friends up north won't send us anything, we can do it on our own, we see as being the solution for us.
Just a few comments. This is a very debated issue on the economics of wind power, but I think on balance it's fair to say, in line with what Katherine is putting forward here, that the recent advances in wind technology means that today the electricity price for wind has come down, is in par or even lower than most of its equivalents. As you know, in Sweden there's even been now a special tax induced to raise the electricity price because the wind electricity price has been lower than the equivalent from other sources. So I think it is competitive on its own grounds. The special case in Sweden is exactly as you point out, that wind produces electricity, and we're very good at producing electricity from hydro and nuclear. And increasingly, I think the analysis is, the sobering analysis is that it may replace some 4 or 5% of the cases where we have fossil dependence on electricity production, but it is a very small fraction, and it should not, to say, replace other renewable sources. So you're right, that's why there's a difference between Denmark and Sweden. I think the most exciting sector in Sweden is biomass. That's the big shift that has happened through the carbon tax, not necessarily the wind sector.
Okay. Isn't it a waste to use biomass to burn it up?
Well,
when you can produce pulp or paper or whatever?
Well, the beauty in Sweden is that it's only residual from the pulp and forest industry. So it is really based on using all the products from the forest industry.
If I could add there, we use a lot of focus on biomass because right now people look at biomass as the obvious replacement for coal. It's just like coal. You can have it in your backyard and shovel it in when you need to burn something. The problem is, if the prices of biomass increase, and why should they not? If everyone becomes interested in this topic, there is enough solar out there to supply the whole world in 2050. There's enough wind out there to supply the whole world. There's enough wave and tidal energy. Biomass, there's simply not enough on this planet to supply all the energy needs we will have. I think biomass will be very important in 2050, but when the prices increase, of course we'll use biomass where it gives the most value in the system. I wasn't together with those 5 economists for nothing. And it doesn't give most value when you burn it to make electricity or heat when you can get cheap wind power or other types. What we will use biomass for when it becomes expensive is where there is no substitution possibility. And that's probably for fluid fuels, for heavy transport, for backup when you don't have other, you can't get wind or hydro, and for making replacements for plastics and clothes and that sort of thing. So I think we'll be using a lot of biomass, but you're right, we're not going to burn it when it gets to be so expensive.
And your question about geothermal, there are some strong differences here. One is we don't need space heating so much. We need it in Canberra in the wintertime, or less so as the climate warms. But most other capital cities are much more worried about cooling, particularly during the January, February, March period. We had a very bad heat wave, of course, in Melbourne and Adelaide in February 2009. So heating is not such a big issue, except in this particular city, which isn't that big. The other use, of course, of geothermal is generating electricity. There we do have some potential in Australia, particularly in South Australia. The problem there is the tyranny of distance that we talked about earlier, is that the good geothermal resources for electricity, and it has to be much hotter, because basically you have to boil water, not just space heat air, are fairly distant from the southeastern Australian grid, which is by far the major electricity user in the country. So some real questions about when you take into account the cost of linking that into the grid from a fairly long distance, and the fact that it's still a very exploratory technology in terms of generating electricity. That is still pretty much in the experimental area. The one intriguing possibility is to use geothermal, now then it would become a misnomer, for space cooling rather than space heating. To give you an example, if you go out to Geosciences Australia, the building here in the south of Canberra, they do use geothermal. I think they have drilled down to about 300 or 400 meters below Canberra, and they circulate air across the rocks down there. It comes up at an even 18 degrees summer and winter. So it heats during the winter months here in Canberra, but during the summer it's a very pleasant 18 degrees Celsius. So I think that hasn't been explored much at all, but I think we would be clever, I think, in this country, because we have good geothermal resources of a modest nature, temperature-wise, around many capital cities, to explore whether we can do a lot of space cooling with so-called geothermal. Now, maybe we're running a bit short on time. Are there any other burning questions out there from anyone? If not, thank you all very much for coming along. Thanks for the very good questions. Thanks to my colleagues.